This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. My guest today is a professor of political science at Boston College and the author of a new book entitled Rebel Power: Why National Movements Compete, Fight and Win, that was recently published by Cornell University Press. The book is a comparative study focusing on four national movements: the Algerian, Palestinian, Israeli and Northern Irish. Dr. Peter Krause, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me, Gilad.
So what are these four case studies that you explore in your book with similarities and differences? Tell us about the relationship between politics and violence.
They tell a lot of things. So I pick those four cases because I'm trying to explain why some nations get states and others don't. And so in the case of the Zionist movement, they get the state of Israel. The Algerians get the state of Algeria. The Irish get Ireland, but not Northern Ireland. And the Palestinians don't have a state of Palestine. So I picked the cases for that purpose. But in the course of looking at those cases, I'm also looking at why groups within those movements use violence or don't. And so what my argument is where you stand depends on where you sit. And what I mean by that is where you stand in the hierarchy of your national movement depends on where you sit on using or restraining violence. So the way I think about that is, in a national movement, it's not just this collective group of people who all agree on everything, just like Israeli politics today. You have multiple political parties. In the case of national movements, you have multiple armed groups. And what they're doing is they're thinking about not just getting the state, but ruling the state. And so if you're in line to rule the state, then you're kind of more risk averse. You're kind of more status quo. You don't want to use as much violence. You want to kind of negotiate and win so you can kind of rule the new state. Whereas if you're a weaker group, you're more likely to be risk acceptant. You're more likely to try to shake things up, and violence is often a way you do that.
Yeah, but so there are two kinds of violence here. Violence that is deployed against the oppressor or whoever the other may be, and internal violence.
Correct.
So these are really two different types of violence in terms of their effect on and their impact
Absolutely.
on the movements and their goals.
Absolutely, and that's one of the key arguments of the book is I look a lot at the internal politics of national movements. So again, it's like looking at the American Revolution or the Zionist movement, multiple parties, and when you have kind of what I call a fragmented movement with multiple significant parties, they spend a lot of their time and effort competing with one another, just like political parties do for office today. Except the difference is they'll sometimes use violence against one another. Now, in the case of the Zionist movement, that was pretty few and far between. There were incidents like the Altalena incident, where you had the Haganah, the predecessor to the IDF, attacking members of the Irgun. For the most part, the Zionist armed groups weren't fighting one another. You look at the Palestinians with Fatah and Hamas, that's been a more common thing to happen. And so that has a lot to do with whether the balance of power is very evenly distributed or very concentrated. And it also has a lot to do with whether the movement itself is successful.
Exactly. So really you can say, why do a national movement succeed? Because they don't turn against one another.
Absolutely. And my argument is they do turn against one another when the power is pretty equal between parties, because then they're squabbling and fighting to become number one. Whereas when you have a hegemon, a very dominant group, what happens is that group is pretty solidly in power. The smaller groups realize they probably can't overtake it, and so therefore it leads to a more cohesive strategy and messaging. That's what happened with the Zionists. They were able to present a pretty united front to the United Nations and others when they were trying to found a state, and that allowed them under Ben-Gurion and others to have clear leadership with the Palestinians lacked.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So which of the other cases is the opposite of that?
So the Irish case is a great example. In terms of founding the Irish Free State in the 1920s, they had hegemony. They had Sinn Féin and the IRA, who were clear leaders of the movement. But during the Troubles, which people probably know more about from 1968 to 1998, you have not only the provisional IRA, you have the official IRA, you have the INLA, you have all these different militant groups that are not just fighting against the British, they're also fighting against each other. They're fighting and killing each other. The other thing is you have political parties. You have Sinn Féin, Spain, which is Jerry Adams' party, squabbling with the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labor Party. And what that means is when it comes time to negotiate for a state or for greater autonomy, you don't have the same message, the same goals. And so you have one party who's negotiating, you have one party who's trying to spoil the negotiations, you have people who are using violence to try to prevent it. And that's one of the reasons that it takes 30 years to get to the Good Friday Agreement, which still doesn't make Northern Ireland part of Ireland, but nonetheless is better than they did before, but it took a long time to get there because of the internal fighting.
And because of the internal fighting. And of course, there's another player in this, perhaps a more invisible one, and that is public opinion. What can you tell us about the role that public opinion plays in vis-a-vis all this infighting?
Yeah, it plays a huge role. So let's think about the Zionist movement. Why is the Haganah more powerful than the Irgun? Why are the labor Zionists more powerful than the revisionist Zionists in the Yishuv before the founding of Israel? A lot of it has to do with public support. The way that Ben Gurion and the labor Zionists were able to dominate the Zionist movement was because they dominated immigration and they dominated settlements inside of the Yishuv. They were able to establish places for people to live coming from Europe or elsewhere. And by doing that, they were able to kind of hand select who was coming over to the Yishuv to some extent, and then have them be loyal to them because they had been given, a place in the Yishuv, the pre-Israeli society. So public opinion in that sense was very important. And then when it came time, of course, to actually have the first votes for the Knesset or otherwise, what happens? The Labor Party, Mapai, dominates, and that's because of what they had built up previously. So public opinion is very important for the strength of these organizations, and to some extent,
what about the success? I'm more interested in the success. How does public opinion help them reach their goal?
It helps them reach their goals because if the public it has consensus in terms of which group should be leading the movement, then it does better. If the public itself lacks consensus and is split, that leads to problems because just like the groups themselves having infighting, that means the public spends a lot of time debating, discussing, not agreeing on, should we agree to this amount of territory or that amount of territory? Should we sign a deal with the enemy? Should we fight the enemy? When the public is split, it leads to problems for the movement.
So would you say that if you look at the Palestinian national movement historically, today as opposed to 30 or 40 years ago, then Yasser Arafat's and Fatah's monopoly was almost completely undisputed, and today there is pretty much they've reached a stalemate because there is a balance of power between the two movements, Fatah and Hamas. So would you say now that the Palestinians are less disposed of achieving the national goals because of that?
So I would make a slight update to that. So there's kind of a back and forth. In the early days of the Palestinian national movement, we're talking 30s, 40s, but if you want to say 60s, 70s when Fatah is created, it's fragmented. So it's not just Fatah, it's the PFLP, it's the DFLP, it's Sa'iqa. There were a number of Palestinian factions, and it's one of the reasons that from the 67 war onwards, the Palestinians don't do a great job at coming close to achieving a state. When they become the closest is in when? The late 1980s, early 1990s during the First Intifada. But it wasn't just because of the First Intifada. It was the fact that Fatah and Arafat came to dominate the PLO in a way they hadn't in the 60s and 70s. And so they're able to declare a state, they're able to negotiate with the Israelis in a way they couldn't before. And then what happens, as you're alluding to, is over the course of the 1990s and by the early 2000s with the Second Intifada, Hamas rises as a significant challenger. So what was a kind of hegemonic movement under Fatah, making more gains they had before during the Oslo process, leads to a fragmented movement which we have today, and that is one of the reasons that the Palestinians haven't made much progress since then, because Fatah's a little wary about negotiating because they're worried about Hamas kind of outbidding them. Hamas is using violence to spoil negotiations. Hamas itself is talking about maybe accepting a deal with the Israelis now, but they're worried about Fatah. So all of these things make it less likely for them to succeed.
So here I go back to my question earlier about public opinion, because in their minds they always think that the public, the people, are perhaps more hardline than they are themselves. Wouldn't you say that this dynamic is really what prevents violent national movements to become more moderate and therefore be more able to pursue their goals?
I think there's some of that. So there's a Palestinian pollster named Khalil Shakaki who's done a number of polls on Palestinian public opinion as well as studies on your exact question. And he does find that people are often more willing to negotiate, but they think others are not. And so that does hold it back to some extent. However, I'll say he also polls Palestinians on which political party or which militant group they support. And he finds fragmented support over time. So at various points, Hamas is up, other times Hamas is down. But he doesn't find, 60, 70, 80% approval for Fatah and Arafat Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas. So in that sense, the Palestinian public today is still very fragmented, not only over which parties they support, but also what strategy to follow. Should it be negotiations? Should it be armed struggle? Should it be, boycott, divestment, sanction, all this type of stuff? There's a lot of difference of opinion among Palestinians, and that hurts their cause.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you now why you chose these four in particular. I mean, there is a common thread, which is that there are national movements, I mean, some successful, some not, but who have at some point resorted to violence. I mean, who played this double game between violence and politics.
Sure.
But did you ever think or consider analyzing national movements and never resorted to violence? I'm thinking about perhaps Quebecois nationalism with the quiet revolution that, the title says a lot.
Yeah.
Or perhaps the Indian national movement, famous for its non-violence. How does that fit into your mold?
It's a great question. Now, I'd first say, the Quebecois have not always been nonviolent. There are a couple instances of kidnapping and things like that, but you're right.
But
in the scheme of things,
short-lived,
less violent than some of these other ones that I studied. You're right. So as a political scientist, one of the things that we do when we're generating a theory, which I'm doing, I'm kind of creating an original theory, is we want variation on our dependent variable, the outcome we're trying to explain. And I'm trying to explain variation in getting a state, and I'm trying to explain variation in violence. So I picked these movements because, as I said at the outset, some got states, some didn't. And then even though they all used violence overall, they also went through periods where they were more or less violent. So, for example, with the Palestinians, First Intifada was much less violent than the Second Intifada. In the case of the Irish, they weren't just constantly bombing the British or attacking each other. So that type of kind of what we call within case variation, where some violent, some not, actually sometimes gives you more analytical leverage to figure out what's going on differently, as opposed to just looking at a movement that's always nonviolent or always violent. So that's one of the reasons I picked those cases initially. But you're correct that one of the next steps is to say, okay, now I've written this book about those four movements. I think I cover them pretty comprehensively, but they're just four amidst hundreds of these. And so one of my next projects is to expand and see to what extent my theory applies to these other movements, whether nonviolent or violent.
Mm-hmm. So do you have any hypotheses that you can share?
I do.
We won't go back. It won't come back to haunt you. I can assure you that.
No, I have no problem hypothesizing. And honestly, making statements that can be wrong is the sign of, science and potential progress. It's too often pundits or academics will say things that can't really be tested or analyzed, and then, you're not really saying anything at all. So I have no problem making some hypotheses. I'll say this. Number one, my argument would be it has a lot to do with the balance of power inside those movements. So I'm not an expert on the Indian national movement or the Quebecois or a number of others, but I would posit that, or my theory would posit, that it's because among the Quebecois or among the Indians, they didn't have, 5 different factions that were really fighting. So like the Indians had Gandhi, who was a pretty strong national leader. He probably had and helped to enforce a degree of hegemony that other movements didn't have. In the case of, say, the American Revolution, that's one I didn't write about in the book, but I know a little bit about. You had the Continental Congress, you had the Continental Army. Even though you had local state militias here and there, pretty much they paid attention to George Washington, the Continental Army, on battlefield tactics, and then politically, the Continental Congress kind of called the tune. So in that sense, I do think that the argument applies to other cases beyond what I looked at, but that's something I'm investigating now.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you also to what extent the changing historical circumstances affect, these national movements. I'm talking about the global atmosphere. I mean, the zeitgeist of international politics rather than the local circumstances, because you are looking at very different. I mean, they're all 20th century, but still very different moments in history. I mean, the Zionists were in the 30s and 40s, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War.
Right.
The troubles in Northern Ireland were further into the 20th century, and the Palestinian national movement,
right.
and those phenomena that you describe still persist today. What can you say really about the historical context in which they operate?
It's a great question. So first off, the way you lay it out is perfect because it gets at one of the challenges I get sometimes, which is, you study so much about the internal politics of these movements, but that's really a sideshow. The main story is decolonization and the fact that, 100 years ago, all these European states controlled, 80% of the world, and yet they decided to decolonize. That's why these states get independence. But what I would argue first is what you're saying, which is, hey, guess what? The Irish kind of got independence during, kind of before decolonization. The Algerians get it kind of in the middle of it. The Israelis get a little earlier. The Palestinians don't have it. So I don't think decolonization can explain all of this stuff. What I do think matters in terms of the international context is the type of foreign support these movements get for their independence. And again, I think the balance of power inside the movement drives that. Let me explain. If you have a fragmented movement with multiple different groups, what that does is it kind of creates a buyer's market for foreign influence, where a foreign state can come in and say, hey, I'm going to support you and you're going to kind of support my cause, kind of like Iran with Hezbollah or something like that. What happens, though, is if that group says, no, I'm not going to, help you out or whatever else, they can say, oh, okay, well, I have 3 other options here. Now I can go to this one. Now I can go to that one. And what happens is you get multiple foreign powers all with their hands in that national movement, and ultimately it prevents that national movement from being successful. Palestinians are a great example of this. All these Arab states are supporting the cause, in air quotes to some extent, but they often have their own agendas, which kind of hurts the Palestinians. On the other hand, if you have a hegemonic movement with one dominant party, now it's a seller's influence, where that group can basically say, hey, you want influence in this movement, you want to help us, I'm the one-stop shop for that, and I call the tune. And so in that sense, I think the international context and how it changes over time matters. But when I look at groups like the Kurds or others today that are still fighting for a state, that's what I see. And what do you see with the Kurds? You see the Turks kind of supporting the KRG in Iraq, but then not the PKK. You see Iran kind of against some of the Kurds, Iraq's mixed. And guess what? That's a problem that comes from the fragmentation among the Kurds themselves. They have multiple political parties, multiple militant groups, and that's one of the reasons they've been held back from having a state.
Mm-hmm. So really, what are the tips? I'm sorry to ask this really populist question here, but say that I was to form a national movement and resort to violence occasionally. What really would you say is the key to success? And actually, we can write the manual for the Palestinian national movement.
Sure.
Judging, I mean, when we touched upon it during this conversation, but I really want to get sort of a bottom line.
No problem.
Really, what are the bare essentials for success as a national movement?
And I think you could read my book either way. You could look at it as a guidebook for being a successful movement, or as a guidebook for a state trying to fight a successful movement. And I would say it extends beyond a national movement. Look at Black Lives Matter movement today, or look at civil rights movement. I would still have advice for them, and here's what I would say. You want to have a hegemonic movement. What I mean by that is you want to unite behind a single organization, because that gives you a cohesive strategy, a clear message, and a greater likelihood of victory. The challenge is, even though as individuals we'll often make sacrifices for the greater good, organizations almost never do that. Organizations are some of the most selfish entities out there because they're designed to make money in the case of businesses or win votes and political power in the case of political parties. And so even though people know this, I'm not necessarily bringing up something people don't know. When I go interview people part of these movements, they know that they need to have a single organization. The problem is they want their organization to be that single organization. So what you would have to do is either look and say, my organization is the strongest, now I have to get everyone to fall in line behind me, whether convincing them or fighting them. Or if I'm a weaker organization, you have to swallow your pride and say, you know what, I'm going to merge into the stronger one for the greater cause, for my movement. If you do that, you'll be successful. The problem is history shows us that rarely happens.
Mm-hmm. And of course, these lessons can be applied to other social movements that are not necessarily national movements.
Correct. Absolutely. So that's what I was saying in terms of, civil rights movement or a modern context, Black Lives Matter movement or others, that makes a big difference, because think about it. If you have multiple organizations talking about, rights for African Americans or minorities or otherwise, the problem can be that one group is saying one message for what their demands or requests are, and another group is saying another one. One group is using violence, one group is just marching. And what it does is it can kind of hurt the name or the broader legitimacy of the movement if some of these groups are being more extreme. That can be an issue. On the other hand, the more extreme groups might say, well, these more moderate ones, they're undercutting us because they're negotiating with the other side, whereas we're trying not to do that. So absolutely the idea of hegemony and not having fragmentation is helpful for any type of movement, whether national or social.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the absence of fragmentation and internal friction and all that seems to me like something that is less prevalent than the opposite? So would you say that successful movements need to fight their own instincts and in some way show maturity that few people and even fewer organizations show?
100% correct. For every successful national movement that has a state, there are hundreds of failures. Hegel said, nations go through a long winding history before they get to kind of their destination, which is a state, and most don't. People think about nationalism in the context of the Kurds, the Palestinians, the Middle East, but guess what? You can look at Europe today. I can show you a map of hundreds of national movements that are still ongoing and have political parties or claims, but they don't seem to have a prayer of success, and some of it has to do with the internal politics of those movements.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dr. Peter Krause, professor of political science at Boston College and the author of the new book, Rebel Power, Why National Movements Compete, Fight and Win. Thank you very much for appearing on our show.
Gilad, thank you so much for having me. And
also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you liked this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shendlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, visit our website, follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.